Hello, I'm Chris Bryant, and welcome to First Draft, the podcast where I talk to leading figures in the creative industries about the challenges and the excitements that they face every day. And today, I'm joined by one of the biggest figures in the museum industry in the world, a man who runs the British Museum, used to run the National Portrait Gallery, Nick Cullinan. I think I'm going to start. So this is First Draft, which is when I, as the Minister for Creative Industries, the Arts and Tourism, talk to some of the people who are really at, I want to say the coalface, but it never really feels quite like the coalface, though that's a reference to my own constituency in South Wales, maybe. But at the coalface of the creative industries. And I'm joined today by Nick Cullinan. I'm never sure. Are you Nicholas or Nick?
Either, both.
Either, both.
Yeah.
You haven't got a preference. I see.
No.
I'm always Christopher when I'm being told off.
I think I'm using Nicholas when it's with my last name because it sounds better, but Nick to people who know me, and I never think about which one people use, so either's fine.
So Nicholas Cullinan.
Nick.
Right. Nicholas, you obviously you run the British Museum now, which is like one of the biggest international visitor attractions in the world.
Mm-hmm.
What does that feel like?
It feels surprisingly good is the wrong word. Natural, like it feels like a good fit. That's what I'm trying to say. And I was actually talking to Glenn Lowry, who's the director of MoMA, who retires next year after 30 years.
The Museum of Modern Art in
New York. Sorry,
yeah,
I'll stop using acronyms. And we were just having a chat about his plans and, who's going to succeed him. I'm not going to try and give any exclusives or clues.
go on.
No, because I don't know, and Glenn doesn't know, obviously. But we were talking about, the point was how much running a museum is about the fit. And that's been the big surprise to me that, you think about the British Museum, as you say, such a huge organization, the first public national museum in the world, more than 6 million visitors a year, the most visited building in the UK, third most visited museum in the world.
Created by Parliament, by legislation in Parliament, which is sometimes complicated for you and for us.
Yeah, incredible. In 1753, created for the nation, it's always belonged to the people of the UK. And more than that, we should talk about that. It's always been imagined that it belongs to everyone, that Hans Sloane left his collection for the benefit of everyone, and we should come back to that. But to answer your first question, because the fit feels so good, it hasn't felt like a huge, challenging step up.
But you're the director of the British Museum. So when you walk in the door, does everybody kind of bow or curtsy?
No. And actually, that was the first thing to do, which is to really get to know the staff and to listen.
How many is it, roughly?
Almost 1,000.
Wow.
And so I spent my first 6 weeks, I went to every department, I met every member of staff, and really listened to what they were doing, what they were excited about, what they were worried about, and to create a culture where we're a team and we're all in it together. We all have different roles and we do different things, but there's this kind of mutual understanding and respect. It's super important. And people are friendly with me and say hello, and I do the same with them.
and so what does the British bit mean in it? Because, I remember taking my nieces around and they were absolutely obsessed with the Egyptian mummies. That was the only thing they were really interested in. They didn't care about the Assyrian stuff or stuff from Latin America or whatever. Yeah. All they were interested in was the Egyptian mummies.
I think that's where every child starts. That's where I started when I was 4, when I first moved to this country. My mum took me and I saw the mummies. Well, apparently we were the first organisation to be called British, which is interesting. But for me, and I think for our founder, Hans Sloane, what the British Museum means is a country that's fascinated by the rest of the world, genuinely interested in understanding and learning about the rest of the world. And that's what the British Museum is. It shows this fascination for all cultures throughout time, all continents. And I think that's an incredible thing for one country to be genuinely fascinated by the rest of the world. So,
and part of that, what used to be classicism, didn't it? It was the kind of Roman, Greek, or Egyptian. That was the kind of foundational bit. It feels like.
Yeah, so the foundation comes from Hans Sloane, who had 70,000 objects. That's a complex story that we can unpack as well. And he obviously left it to the nation. And as you say, 1753, Act of Parliament, the first public national museum created for the world. And part of that was antiquities, but part of Hans Sloane's collection was also natural specimen, and that eventually became the Natural History Museum books, and that eventually
which is another bit of legislation, wasn't it? I think, yeah,
exactly. The British Library, of course. Yep. So we've also birthed other museums, but his collection was multifaceted and ranged across different disciplines, and was even more expansive than the British Museum is now, because it included books and natural history, etc.
So two things that fascinated me, and I mean, I used to go a lot when I first wrote books, because I used the round reading room, which is, I mean,
Incredible.
famous. That slightly weird blue coloured leather stuff, but
Desk,
and it used to be miserable because all the books were kept in stacks, which filled all the space in between the round reading room and the rest of the building, which is now that wonderful, beautiful, open atrium. But because the British Library was built, but I loved the Mexican room, which I think is done jointly with the Mexican government, isn't it? It's a kind of collaboration.
Yeah, and actually, I was just in Mexico a couple of weeks ago.
Right. So tell us about collaborations with other countries.
Well, I mean, that was one of the big surprises for me in going through the interview process for this job. And then, as I said, the first few weeks on the job, talking to colleagues, listening to them, learning from them, is just how much the British Museum does around the country and around the world. And I think one of the challenges and opportunities for us is to really get that across more and better, because I think a lot of people don't know about it. And I could give you so many examples. I mean, I'll start with Mexico, where I was a couple of weeks ago. We have this amazing network called the Santo Domingo Center for Excellence in Latin American Research, or SD-CELAR for short.
Which you mean the acronym?
That's exactly. Another acronym. I said I wouldn't use them. And that works across Latin America and the Caribbean, and especially working with indigenous communities. So I was in Oaxaca to see the work we're doing there. But it's an amazing project. Then every year we have a project called the International Training Program, where museum professionals from all around the world, usually all continents, spend time at the British Museum and another museum in the UK and learn from those experiences. But most importantly, learn from each other. So now there's this incredible international, massive alumni network over the many years the program has been in effect, where people can learn from each other if they have a question. I was talking to a curator from Cyprus, and she said to me, it was so wonderful to come here because before I arrived, I thought, the British Museum, everything is done in a different way. And I realized you have the same challenges that my museum has, which is, your roof leaks or it's too hot in the summer. So it's very human. We learn from each other. There's an amazing program called the Endangered Material Knowledge Program, again, where participants from all around the world come again to the BM and study material knowledge systems that are in danger of becoming extinct. So someone came to look at breadfruit from the Solomon Islands this summer, for example. I mean, I could go on and on. I mean,
so just going back to Mexico, because one of my favorite items is there's a coiled snake, which you can see the underside of as well, because there's a mirror laid underneath it. And I just remember when I very first went to the Mexican room, it was pretty dire. It wasn't very well presented. And now it's completely transformed. So just talk to us about how as technology changes, as modern world changes, and people have different interests in the way things are presented, how you change the presentation of what you've already got.
Well, I mean, a museum on the scale of the British Museum, it's a bit like the Firth of Forth Bridge. It's never done. You're always working on it. We have 3,500 rooms in the museum. And there's a big program to, over perhaps the next 2 decades, to gradually rehang and refurbish all the galleries, not just for the sake of interior decoration, but there's, some of the galleries do need work, like, the ceiling leaks and we need to address it. It's not something that can wait much longer. But the other opportunity is, obviously we represent, as I mentioned, most cultures, hopefully, many cultures from around the world, but there are things in the collection that we don't currently represent. So, for example, the Caribbean, nothing. And think about, the fact that Jamaica is very important to the British Museum in a complex way, because Hans Sloane spent time in Jamaica and his wife owned plantations, and he actually was a doctor to slaves in Jamaica, but also learned from them about Jamaica's history, and that informed the collection from the very beginning. There's areas of South Asia, like Indonesia, that again are in the collection we don't show. So it's really important.
There's some Pacific Islands material, isn't there? Quite interesting
there is.
Section. And I was always interested in the way you present Islamic art, because often, that sounds like there's one version of Islamic art. There's not. There's many different kinds, and different parts of Islam have decided have different rules about what can be presented and what can't be presented. But how do you make sure that when 100,000 people come from different countries, or no, millions come every year. What is it, 3 million people every year, something like that?
Well, every year we have, we're probably on track for about 6.5 million visitors this year, and
Right.
more than half of those are international visitors. Yeah.
So those 3 million coming in, how do you make sure that the version that they understand the version that's in front of them?
That's a good question. I mean, what I would say is it's not just monolithic. So obviously we have people that visit the galleries, the public galleries. That's the majority of people. But to the point about indigenous or heritage communities, many of those communities visit the museum and visit objects that we have within the collection that maybe aren't even on view, or they want to spend time alone with those objects. And so, especially my colleagues in the Department of AOA, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, spend a huge amount of time with visiting indigenous source communities that want to see certain objects. Often there can be almost a spiritual aspect to those visits. And it's very important that those things are conducted very sensitively, privately. And we spend a huge amount of time doing that, which is super important.
So kind of what percentage of your stuff is on show?
Okay, so I'm going to give you this. I'm going to give you the honest answer. It sounds bad, and then I'm going to unpack it a little bit.
I know you've got lots of bits and pieces.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a collection of 8 million objects. What's important to say?
Can you count them?
We are counting them. We're digitizing all of them, which is really important, and will mean that we could have one of the great museum digital resources in the world, which is very exciting. So 8 million objects. What's important to say is that, not all of those objects are masterpieces of monolithic sculpture. About half of those are pottery fragments, which are really important to us because we are an archaeological institution.
But you wouldn't necessarily want to go and visit a whole gallery full of pottery shards.
Well, some people do. And for example, we've got the new research collection in Reading, which is available for public access. And we have lots of scholars that are consulting pottery fragments there, which are very important. So 8 million objects. Of that, about 1% is on view at the British Museum, so about 80,000. But that's not to say that, first of all, the other thing is there's what's on view in London. There's the fact that we have a lot more on view all around the country. So we had 6.2 million visitors this year, but 8 million people saw an object outside of London, elsewhere in the UK, which is we should talk about, is super important.
I want to get onto that,
yeah, really important to both of us. We lend all around the world. And I'm very interested in the BM being a kind of, we talked about it, but a lending library. Right. So it's not, obviously, it's very important who comes to visit the kind of mothership in London, but we need to be reaching...
The mothership?
Yeah, call it
Captain Kirk.
But we need to be reaching much beyond that. So thinking about how we, collaborate, how we share our collection with partners all around the country and around the world.
So obviously some other London-based national museums have decided to sort of set up satellites elsewhere in the UK, and that's been their way. But the British Museum's never gone down that route.
No, which is interesting.
There's not a British Museum North. There's not a British Museum Wales or whatever.
No, but so the way that we've done it, I mean, we have the Archaeological Research Collection in Reading, which is an amazing storage facility. But what the BM has been doing for a while, and we want to do much more of, and we are, is to have these partnership galleries. And I actually really like that model. Rather than sort of sticking our name on something and saying British Museum North, we actually work in collaboration with, for example, Manchester Museum, which I visited this summer, and that's kind of where I'm from. My dad was from Manchester. I used to go to that museum a lot. And we've done this amazing project with the Manchester Museum, with the South Asian Gallery, where we worked with the museum and the local South Asian community who co-curated the displays and decided what they wanted to see in the community, rather than us coming and saying, we want to share these masterpieces with you good people of Manchester. It's actually initiated by the local community. And I think for me, that's a really interesting model. And so we have an ambition to create 5 more of those partnership galleries over the next 5 years.
So you probably know that a few years ago in my patch in the Rhondda, partly because I lobbied quite ferociously for this during our arts festival, you sent, I don't think it was particularly valuable, but it was a very beautiful Japanese articulated dragon. And obviously dragons in Wales, very important. It was in Treorchy Library. I remember a kid saying to his dad as they were leaving, "But Daddy, we haven't seen the dragon yet." And I mean, we could probably have made a bit more of that when it happened. But I just wondered whether, because that's not having a great big, deal with another gallery. It's just quite a simple thing. I wonder how much of that you can and should do.
Yeah, definitely. Also, I love the idea that a Chinese dragon is adopted by...
Japanese dragon.
A Japanese dragon is adopted by a Welsh community. I think that's lovely. It's kind of...
Well, they wanted to know why it's different. Why is a Japan... So, you know what a Welsh dragon looks like.
Yeah.
There's a point about whether dragons can be male and female, or are they all female?
Good point. Yeah.
It's unclear,
Okay.
I think, in mythology. But anyway, Japanese ones tend to be much longer. Anyway.
Yeah. But that's a lovely example of creating a sense of local pride by looking outwards. And I mean, that's something we did at the National Portrait Gallery. Maybe I shouldn't talk about that museum. But
You're allowed to.
Okay.
Which you did the major refurbishment and the rehang and everything of, didn't you?
Yeah, so I was there for 9 years, and it was amazing to do a sort of transformation of a much-loved historic institution, but inside out, top to bottom. But part of that was also about what we did beyond the walls of the museum. And we pioneered this program, which the Department of Culture, Media and Sport supported, called Coming Home, where we would lend one portrait back to a community. So, for example, I grew up in West Yorkshire, in Hebden Bridge, and the kind of closest cultural thing to me was the Bronte parsonage in Haworth, where the Bronte sisters obviously grew up. And when you visit there, all of the portraits are in the National Portrait Gallery. And what's in the parsonage, I think still, but then when
including
I was a boy,
that sort of slightly battered one.
The one that Bramwell painted of the three sisters and then painted himself out.
Right, yes, that's
right. And it's battered because it was folded up and found on top of a wardrobe. And, but super important in that those are the only images we have of what the Bronte sisters looked like. So Bramwell's portrait of the three sisters, and then there's the famous drawing of Charlotte and his painting of Emily as well. Anyway, when I would go and visit there as a boy, you'd have kind of colour reproductions, and it would say the original is in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And I remember thinking that, I guess that means everything good is in London. So what does that mean about where I'm from?
Completely.
And so I remember when I started, I talked about this story and I said, could we start to lend these things back? And we did it. And so the Bronte portrait went back to Haworth. David Beckham, that video of him by Sam Taylor-Johnson went back to Whipps Cross Hospital in Essex, where he was born. An amazing portrait of Stormzy and his mother that we have went to Croydon Library. And everywhere we did that, attendance shot up. I think in Croydon, with the Stormzy portrait, like 357%. Communities really adopted it. It was affordable for the institution. It was just one thing, because it wasn't overstretching them. Collaborating in a way that is feasible for the organization that you're working with. And also, what I liked about the Coming Home program was it wasn't about the National Portrait Gallery in London at all. It was about that person and that place. Right. So it was about the Brontes in Haworth, and it was about making people, like school children who visited local school groups, feel proud of where they're from and begin to feel, to go back to your dragon, to begin to feel part of a bigger national story and one with international resonance.
So what does that mean for the British Museum? What's the parallel for that?
Well, I want to do the same thing, which is to really create the sense of, definitely starting in the UK, working with communities across the UK, understanding what they want to see and how we can best support them, work with them, offer up what we have in the collection. But hopefully, and that's why I love your story, making that community feel part of being British in a good way. And to go back to your earlier question, making Britishness feel part of an interconnected story of looking out to the world. And I think, that where I'm proudest of being British, if I'm British, I wasn't born here, but I feel British. And this is the country that I choose to live in and work in, is a Britain that is outward looking and wants to collaborate and wants to trade and wants to do all of these things.
I put it slightly differently. I always think that we're at our best when we're at the crossroads of the nations.
Yeah.
Because, when you think about our literature as well, so much of it is informed by Caribbean influences or African or Indian.
Absolutely.
Writing in English often, and in fact, even if you look at our Nobel Prize winners for literature, quite a lot of those are people who, some of their life or a large chunk of their life was spent elsewhere than in the UK.
Absolutely. I suppose there's two types of islands, right? There's an island that's insular and trying to defend itself and look inwards. Yeah. And there's an island that wants to trade with the world and explore and learn. And that can be problematic too, as we all know. But it's the second type that I find more interesting, where we use the fact that we're surrounded by water to reach out and to think about how we can learn, collaborate, trade, all those things, ideas, objects, information.
So what do you think is the most important thing that you would want to say to government at the moment?
I think what's really important right now for this country, I mean, not even for the sector, for the country, is to, and we all know, it's challenging financially, but let's have a really bold idea and let's be confident and think about how we can do something incredible. And I think that is not budget dependent. You can have good ideas and be innovative even with no money. And I think it's just really important that, I mean, for me, one of the things this country still does best, which you talked about, is culture. We punch above our weight in terms of, think about music, for example. British music goes around the world.
I'm amazed when I go to Latin America. Everywhere it's British bands. And you'd think it would be American bands, but it's not. It's British bands everywhere.
We're a tiny country in the world, and yet our music goes around the world. British film, British fashion.
We sell more books than any other country.
Literature. And our museums are incredible. I mean, the fact that the British Museum gets 6.5 million visitors a year, people come from all over the world to see it. So these things we should be super proud of. They're not nice to have. They're actually part of our identity as a nation. They're the things we do the best. I think people probably visit London not for maths, but for culture is probably a big part of it. And the return you get on those things for the amount of money that you actually have to support them with is exponential. And so it's just having that confidence and also wanting to kind of champion and having a vision for what we do culturally and the difference that makes.
So one of my anxieties, because I'm also the tourism minister, is I want us to get to 50 million international visitors by 2030. We had 38 million this last year. That's quite an ambitious target. But if you're going to have 50 million, they can't all come to London. But unfortunately, in recent years, roughly 60% of people who come from overseas to the UK say they're only interested in coming to London. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe I wonder whether there's anything the big institutions in London can do to enable people to go to see other parts of the UK, because it's not everything happens here.
Definitely, and I think London could be and should be an amazing shop window for the rest of the country. I'm from the north of England. Yeah, London is where I live and work, but I really care about the rest of the country and making sure that there's a quality of opportunity for all of us. It's really important. You can't just privilege one part of the country. That way isn't sustainable. So I think it should be an amazing shop window. It's also, in a way, one of the best things about the British Museum is it's a great shop window also for the rest of the world. The reason that the Mexican government supported us on the Mexican gallery is because they know that when people visit that gallery, they might say, oh, this is amazing, I must go to Mexico. Or, for example, I had a delegation from Peru, including the minister and the embassy, and we also collaborated with them on our displays of Peruvian art, and they're so happy they talked about it as an amazing kind of embassy for
You
Peru.
had a great exhibition a few years ago as well.
But
the Incas.
I would love if our success in terms of visitor numbers, which just go up and up every year, is got to benefit other organizations around the nation and further afield. And so I'm really passionate about that. And again, those partnership galleries we do, it's a really good point you make. Maybe there's a way that we can actually make reference to those in the galleries in London to try and.
Well, I was kind of wondering, because you've talked about stuff from you going to them. Mm-hmm. I wonder about whether on occasion you could have a wall which is, by the way, this is the Farron's Gallery, or this is the
absolutely
whatever.
It's not hierarchical, and we're actually doing that next year for the first time. We've had an amazing partnership over about 15 years with the CSMVS Museum in Mumbai, and for the first time next year, they curate an exhibition that comes to us. Right. And I think to have that real equality of partnership and dialogue so it's not like the British Museum in broadcast mode going out to the regions or the rest of the world. It's a proper collaboration.
Cool. So we're going to do a quick fire round now. You're not meant to edit.
Okay.
And you've got some questions for me, and I'll have some for you. But my number one is, so for you, what is the best museum in the world other than the British Museum and the National Portrait Gallery?
I'm going to choose one of the two museums that I kind of grew up with. So the nearest museums I used to go to, because I was equidistant between them, were Leeds and Manchester. I've mentioned Manchester before.
Right.
But those are the museums I used to visit.
The Cartwright in Leeds, is that? Or?
There's Cartwright Hall, and actually we're collaborating with them next year. So there's the Leeds City Gallery, which I was there a couple of weeks ago. and then, of course, Manchester Museum, amongst others. But that's kind of why I got into museums. I remember my parents would take me. I remember I saw an amazing Corot show at the Manchester Museum when I was about 9 or 10.
Right.
So those ones.
Cool.
They do an amazing job.
You'll go.
What's your biggest surprise about this sector and your job? Like, what's surprised you the most the last few months?
So I thought that every single meeting would start with, "Can we have some more money, please?" And it hasn't been that at all.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes it comes in at the end of the meeting, but actually, most people's issues are so diverse in different sectors. Whether it's I have film, I have architecture and publishing, and so many different aspects, and. So yes, it's the fact that not everybody's asking for money, which is a delight.
Good. Great.
Next one for you. If you were allowed to own a single thing in the British Museum, what would it be?
It's funny, I'm not very acquisitive with objects. Like I'm not materialistic, although I spend my life looking after them. I suppose one thing that means a lot to me is the Portland vase, which I've been thinking a lot about.
Oh, I don't know that.
Oh, okay. So it's one of the great Roman glass cameo vases ever.
Right.
And we've had it. It was put on loan to us by the Dukes of Portland, and then it was on loan for about 200 years. It was actually destroyed in the 19th century by a drunken visitor who came in and just smashed it into smithereens. And it was painstakingly pieced back together. And since then, that was the first time, twice more, so 3 times. So it's an amazing example of how something can be kind of destroyed and through dedication and knowledge and expertise pieced back together. We then acquired it in 1945, which I think is beautiful. There was a sort of national appeal to acquire it just as London and the UK and the rest of the world was putting itself back together after the Second World War. So I think about that object a lot, about how something can be totally broken and then repaired.
Okay, you'll go again.
I don't know if you've had much time to read this year, but like favorite book that you've read, maybe?
So I'm reading at the moment, or rather I'm listening to Scapegoat, which is the story of the first Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, who had a love affair with the king, or the king had a love affair with him, King James VI. It's by Lucy Hughes Hallett. And it's amazing because apart from the else, Buckingham was an enormous collector of art.
Yeah.
And his guy, Gerbier, I mean, his passion about individual, whether it's Tintorettos or Titians or whatever, I mean, and some of the things that have ended up in public galleries around the world, obviously Buckingham was, well, not obviously, but Buckingham was killed in 1628 in a pub in Portsmouth, I think. I haven't got that there yet in the story, but it's absolutely amazing story.
It's
really well
It's
told.
an amazing story. And of course, there's the wonderful portraits on display at the National Portrait Gallery.
Indeed.
James I in Buckingham.
Yes. Well, and the one of Buckingham is with very white legs.
Those legs, they're incredible.
They're extraordinary. All right, calm down.
No, just because they're like mannerist. They're so elongated.
I know.
Yeah.
And he's obviously showing them off for the king, who liked his legs and talks about his legs in lots of letters.
I started watching but didn't finish the TV series based on
Oh, yeah, no.
that love story.
So I feel a bit aggrieved because years ago I went to see Stuart Prophet, who was then commissioning editor at Penguin, with an idea of writing a book about George Villiers.
Okay.
And he said, no, nobody would be interested. And I
Wrong.
said, anyway, it's been a TV series and it's now Scapegoat. And to be fair, she's done it better than I would have done. I've got one more question for you.
Go on.
What's the best piece of advice anybody has ever given you, either in your museum life or just in life?
Okay, well, I mean, the basic advice is, if you love something, just do it, stick with it. But actually something kind of maybe more interesting is I've worked a lot over the years with Miuccia Prada, the fashion designer, who's a genius and amazing. And when she was opening her foundation in Milan, and I was working with her on that in 2015, we were trying to come up with a kind of strong statement of what it was for and what was different. And I said, what's driving you? What's your motivation? And she said, well, and I remember verbatim because it made such an impression on me. She said, my whole life, I've never understood why things that are banal and coarse are meant to be attractive and things that are more refined and difficult are meant to be unattractive. And all I've ever wanted to do with my fashion designs and my art collection is to make intelligent things attractive. Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
To make intelligent things attractive. And I think that's what museums should do. That you include people, you make people want to learn more about something by communicating it well and crisply. But in doing that, you don't dumb down or pander to people. You actually encourage people's innate curiosity. I think that's an amazing thing to say.
It's not all that distant from William Morris, isn't it? Have nothing in your house which you do not either know to be useful or believe to be beautiful.
Exactly, yeah. It's the same. Yeah.
Grand. I think we're done.
That was great.
Nick,
Thank you.
And Nicholas.
Chris,
Both of you.
thank you.
And Christopher. Thank you very much for joining me today at the Department for Culture, Media and Sport for First Draft.
Thank you.